A hospital was mistakenly struck. We would never intentionally target a protected medical facility. I must allow the investigation to take its course, and therefore I'm not at liberty to discuss further specifics at this time.
Well, that right there is John Campbell, a top commander in Afghanistan. He says the recent airstrike on a Doctors Without Borders hospital was a mistake. You heard it straight from his mouth right there. And joining me now for this story and more is political commentator, former presidential candidate Pat Buchanan, also a former senior advisor to President Nixon. Pat, it's great to talk to you. Obviously, the situation in Afghanistan is very sticky. It's been called the graveyard of empires. How does this particular mistake change the narrative and the mission in Afghanistan?
I don't think it does, John. I do think it might change the attitude of the American people about it. I think it's got to be investigated. I don't believe the Americans would deliberately attack and destroy a hospital that they thought was a hospital, but it's got to be investigated. But I think what it does tell us, and what the situation in Kunduz in the north tells us, where the Afghans lost the city for several days, is if the United States pulls its 10,000 troops out of Afghanistan, everything we invested in for the last 14 years is in danger of falling.
That's what I hear from friends of mine who are Marines that fought in places like Marja. They say everything that they've done or did in Afghanistan is basically eroded away. So what is the case then for staying in Afghanistan, considering things are going so horribly right now?
Well, I think the case that's going to be made is people have argued, and especially the Republicans, that the removal of all American forces from Iraq resulted in the absolute wipeout of our investment, whole and entire, and that would happen, and whether we like it or not, if we want to preserve it, we're going to have the troops in Afghanistan, 10,000 of them.
Yeah, well, let's move on. I want to talk about Russia in Syria, and now getting reports that there are ground forces on the ground there, also Russian warplanes flying over Turkish airspace. Vladimir Putin seems hell-bent on some sort of confrontation with the United States. Do you think that's the case?
No, I don't. I think what Putin is signaling us is that he has an investment in Assad. It's his naval base on the Mediterranean there in Syria. That's an ally. He's more reliable and alive than we were with Hosni Mubarak. And this is all a signal to the United States that you've got to stop aiding these rebels. You've got to stop trying to bring Assad down, because we will fight to preserve him. The Russians have raised and called here. I don't think they want a confrontation with the United States. They would like the United States to agree to let Assad remain in power, quite frankly, and I think that's in the interest of the United States, John.
Right.
Let's suppose Assad falls.
It's
Who do we
almost as
think
if
arrives
people,
in Damascus?
Right. It's almost as if people have not learned anything after the fall of Saddam Hussein, when we did not keep government institutions in place, no standing army in place, and what we have with Iraq today is potentially what could be in Syria, perhaps even worse.
Well, yeah, I mean, far worse. If you get ISIS in power in Damascus, I think then Baghdad becomes imperiled, because they've got a strategic base camp to feed their ISIS forces in Iraq.
If Assad were to stay in power, that would require a complete 180 from this current administration based on their policy in Syria. Do you think it's irresponsible for them not to do that, though, considering what we know now about the current situation?
I do indeed. And those people who are arguing that the United States should establish a no-fly zone, we don't have the constitutional authority to engage in acts of war against the Syrian government that has not attacked us. I mean, to impose a no-fly zone means to shoot down Syrian planes, to shoot down Syrian helicopters, to attack Syrian airfields and their defenses. Those are acts of war. And when Barack Obama went to the Congress back in 2013 to get authorization to attack Syria, the Congress said, in effect, did nothing, because the American people rose up and said no. We have got to think this through. What we have in Syria, you got ISIS, one terrorist group, and Al-Qaeda, another, fighting against Hezbollah, a terrorist group, and two terrorist state sponsors, Iran and Syria. We have to pick and choose here, and if I had to choose anyone, I would choose to stand with Assad against ISIS, and that's what the Russians are doing.